This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 592 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. What better way to gear up for the weekend than to spice up your thirsty Thursday night football with FanDuel and Captain Morgan? Introducing Captain Morgan's Thursday Night Pick'em, a completely free-to-play contest series that gives you 4 chances to win a share of $10,000. Here's how it works. FanDuel fans will have the chance to answer 10 questions centered around both Captain Morgan and that Thursday's NFL matchup. Fans who answer the most questions correctly will be eligible to earn their share of the week's $10,000 cash prize. Thursday Night Football will kick off before you know it, so head to FanDuel.com/CaptainMorganNFL and spice up your game day today. Must be 21 years or older to participate. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app. Eligibility restrictions apply. And don't forget to spice up your game day with Captain Morgan. We saw Sony Michel as the Rams' bell cow this past week. We'll have to see how things play out in that backfield. Whoever's getting the most touches, though, could see some favorable regression heading their way. On the season, no team has a higher pass-to-rush touchdown ratio than the Rams do. Their 3.75 ratio is by far the highest of the Sean McVay era. The previous high over the last 4 years was 1.65. Now, to be fair, their current ratio isn't some crazy outlier, but it does rank in the 97th percentile when looking at how teams have scored their touchdowns since 2011. So I think it's fair to expect it to drop at least a little bit, which favors the rushing attack. I mentioned on last week's 15 Transaction Show how David Montgomery was seeing high snap shares and he was getting a lot of work, but the production just wasn't there. I more specifically talked about the fact that he hadn't seen good target share numbers, but he was still running a lot of routes for Chicago. The team just hadn't been targeting their running backs. In Week 13, we saw the impact that peripherals can have on output. The Bears targeted Montgomery on 22.5% of their targeted attempts. That gave him his highest target share of the entire season. Now, we shouldn't expect that to happen every week, and that's not what I was predicting to happen. Don't think that this is me just trying to victory lap that recommendation. I'm just trying to point out that things like routes run, they can help us spot these things. When we're talking a 3-game sample of not a whole lot of targets, if a player is still out there running and getting a lot of work, that's still really important. And David Montgomery showed us why in Week 13. T. Higgins has now had back-to-back games with at least a 33% target share for Cincinnati. And in those 2 games, he's been a top 5 option at wide receiver in weekly scoring. Across the season in games played by Higgins, he's actually out-targeted Jamar Chase 82-76. Now, I'm not sure that we can take the last 2 weeks as anything but positive variance for T. Higgins, because he's had such high target shares. That's not going to continue. But I do think he's a better fantasy football asset than how he'd been performing across his first 8 games before this 2-game stretch. So expect something more in the middle of those 2 outputs moving forward. At the very least, stop sleeping on T. Higgins. Offensive situation matters in fantasy football. We should be striving for volume, and players seeing good workloads can still be fine in bad offenses. But it sure helps when your fantasy assets are tied to good offenses. And speaking of which, let's talk about the Buccaneers. I talked about them last week a little bit too. On the season, Tampa Bay has scored 46 total touchdowns. That's 4 more than the second place Colts. It's also 28 touchdowns more than both Houston and the Giants. That means the Texans and Giants combined to have 10 fewer touchdowns than Tampa Bay this year. Is it a surprise that Tampa Bay has 3 fantasy-relevant pass catchers without another one who would be fantasy-relevant if he was playing? And a running back who's an RB1, while the Texans and Giants have next to nothing? Of course not, because offensive situation matters. I just found those touchdown numbers to be kind of shocking, so I had to share. Without DeAndre Swift on Sunday, Jamal Williams handled 70.8% of Detroit's running back rushes. That's a pretty decent number, but it was down from the previous week when DeAndre Swift got hurt. Williams also saw a 2.6% target share. That was one of his lower marks of the season. And unfortunately, unlike the David Montgomery stuff from earlier, this was definitely usage-based. Jamal Williams only ran 9 routes against the Vikings. Godwin Igwebuike led the backfield with 25 routes run. That's going to limit Williams' upside as long as DeAndre Swift is out. There was a chance that he would be an RB1 without DeAndre Swift, but we're looking at an RB2 with limited upside from a projection standpoint now. That's as long as this receiving usage continues. Tevin Coleman saw an even bigger backfield share without Michael Carter this past week. He handled almost 85% of New York's running back rushes, and for a second straight week, he saw at least an 11% target share. He's now averaged 13.5 rushes and 3.5 targets per game without Carter. And last week was big because his running back rush share went from about 52% up to that 85% mark. He's absolutely the Jets running back that you want. Until Michael Carter comes back, of course. I'm still of the belief that better days are ahead for DK Metcalf. And I'm not just talking about next season or throughout his career. I mean in 2021. Since Russell Wilson returned, Metcalf has averaged 6.5 PPR points per game. But he's seen 8 targets in 3 of those 4 games. And his target share per game is about 22%. Now that's lower than his target share in his 8 games prior, which was 27%. But in terms of raw volume, Metcalf was averaging just 7 targets per game during his first 8. That's exactly what he's averaging right now, or since Russell Wilson has returned. He's even averaging almost identical 15-plus air yard targets per game numbers too. I'm not saying he should be doing what he did earlier this season. I'm just saying that if you trust DK Metcalf as a player, which you should, and you believe that Russell Wilson can be better, which you probably should, then Metcalf will get better. And their remaining schedule isn't bad either. You can usually tell what a team wants to do offensively when the team is in a neutral game script, or when they're running an offensive play with the game within 6 points. That's how I typically define neutral game script. When you compare a team's overall pass rate to their pass rate in that neutral game script situation, you can see if the team is generally doing what they want to do. And with the Jets this year, that hasn't been the case. Overall, they have the second highest pass rate in the league. But in neutral game scripts, when games are close, they actually rank 20th. Their difference in pass rate in those 2 scenarios is the largest in the league. And that has to do with the fact that they lead the league in plays run while trailing. And they also lead the league in plays run while trailing by 10 or more points. When you can't hold a lead, you're bound to throw the ball more. Things were looking good for Patrick Mahomes after the first month of the season. He was averaging almost 28 standard fantasy points per game, which was the most in the league. Since that point in time, Mahomes has given us just 2 top 10 performances. He's averaged 16.3 points per game, and he's been a high-end QB too. I'm not going to give up on Patrick Mahomes because it's Patrick Mahomes. He also has 0 passing touchdowns over the last 2 weeks, which we just shouldn't assume holds. But it wouldn't be right to say that he's the same old Patrick Mahomes, that he's automatically going to bounce back. There are very clearly a handful of quarterbacks across fantasy that we should want more from here on out. But let's hope that he can get things right against Vegas this week. It unfortunately may not happen for Rashad Bateman in year 1. He saw just 2.7% of Baltimore's targets against Pittsburgh this past week, and he now has 3 straight performances where he scored single-digit PPR points. According to Pro Football Focus, in Week 13, he ran the 4th most routes at wide receiver for Baltimore. He was 2nd in Week 12, and he was 1st in Week 11 when Marquise Brown was out. Hopefully this was just a little blip, but I'm not sure that it is. On Monday, Jamison Hensley of ESPN tweeted, quote, John Harbaugh on if he wants to see wide receiver Rashad Bateman, 1 target on Sunday, more involved in the offense. Quote, we like it when a number of guys are targeted. It doesn't always work out that way. You can't create that. When you start chasing that, that's when problems happen. There was a lot of potential for Rashad Bateman to step up this year, but it just hasn't happened. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly Sleeper Show.